So the homework began with simply adding the name that we already had to the details, or not details, excuse me, stats div that we added at the last minute there. So we have this empty div here with an ID of stats. And when the form is submitted, we wanted to add the name. Oh, this wasn't supposed to be committed. We wanted to add what we typed in there here instead of the header, the heading. Which doesn't sound too tough. So let's do it real quick. Who got it done? Who did it? Who changed it to add it to the div instead of the H1? Yeah. Who did the first part of the homework is what I'm asking. Yeah. Good. All right. Well, it seems all we need to do is, instead of getting the heading, we need to get that div, right? So I'll call it stats, I suppose. And the query selector instead of H1 should be what? Like you mean it, yeah. Hash stats will do. Stats text content equals name instead of the other. I suppose update heading isn't a terribly accurate name for this method anymore, so I'm going to function, excuse me, it's not a method. So I will change that. I'll just call it handle submit. That's its job. It's a submit handler. So don't forget to change it down here. If we didn't, let's see what would happen. Because this is an error message you're going to see all the dang time. But you won't see it at all if you don't have your DevTools open, right? But we learned yesterday we should always keep our DevTools open. So when something doesn't work, it might be nice and tell us what the problem is. So again, on a Mac, Option, Command J. On Windows, Shift, Control J. To open up our JavaScript console. You can type stuff in here, blah, blah, blah. Type JavaScript right there and watch it execute. And we can see our errors. Ah, shucks. Update heading is not defined at index.js line 11. Well, gosh, it's an error. I don't know what to do. No, slow down. Read it. Update heading is not defined on line 11. That's what the :11 here means. Line 11, I do in fact see a reference to update heading, and it's telling me it's not defined. So update heading isn't what I think it is at this point in the code. In this case, we already know what the problem is because we just broke it. This used to be update heading. It's not anymore. So now that's basically referring to a variable that we never declared. So it is undefined. So change it to handle submit. And then, with any luck, we can say, yay, it added it to the div instead of the H1. Life is good. Homework part 1. But we don't just do the bare minimum. Bonus credit, add it to a paragraph inside the stats div. Did anybody do this? How'd you do it? In the HTML? Okay. 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 So if inside the div we put a paragraph, what if we didn't give that paragraph an ID and we still wanted to do it that way? Anybody know how we would do that? Here, I made my HTML so that there is an empty paragraph inside the stats div, but I didn't put an ID directly on the paragraph. Anybody know how I would target that with a selector? Yeah, Todd.
Can you just create a variable and then do like document create element and then set the attributes to the element and then append child to the stats?
Absolutely, and that is what we're going to learn to do. But since this is how he did it, I want to talk about this for just a second. But yeah, great. That's a good way to do that. Anybody know how we would target this paragraph with a selector and make sure that it's this paragraph and not any other that happens to be on the page? Yeah, Porter? So if we wanted to target that paragraph, hash stats gives us the div, right? And he said space p. That'll do it. So a space is the descendant selector in selector syntax. And what that means is the paragraph is the element we're targeting. But we're looking specifically for any paragraph that is a descendant of stats. In other words, is somewhere inside the contents of that div. It doesn't have to be an immediate child. There could be some elements in between. There could be a div within a div and the paragraphs inside that. That would still work. That would still find it. So basically anywhere at any level underneath and inside that stats div, this would find that paragraph. So a paragraph that is descended from stats, yeah. Then query selector all would find them both. Query selector always just finds the first element that matches whatever that selector is. So the selector would definitely find them both. But if we just use query selector instead of query selector all, it'll just return the first one. Yep. So totally valid way to do that. And before we get to the way that Todd suggested, there's another way we could do it. Did anybody do it a little differently? Did anybody use innerHTML to do it? Olivia? Yeah, what'd you do?
So I set an ID for the paragraph within it, and then I set that ID, I made a constant, called it div paragraph, and set it equal to document.querySelector #div p, and then the div paragraph dot innerHTML equals name plus the variables that we did.
Okay, cool. innerHTML, just basically instead of text content, right? Then you could actually type some HTML into the text box if you wanted to. Did anybody use innerHTML to create the paragraph instead of putting it in the HTML file? Do you know what I mean? So we could, instead of putting this here, just leave stats nice and empty. And then instead of just setting the text content to name, I could set the innerHTML to something like that. Dig?
It's something kind of similar. I just created an array and I stored it there each time and added it to the array and printed it out. I was just a little different.
So every time you submitted the form, you added that name or whatever to the array. Okay, and then like loop over it to print it out. So you print out the whole thing each time, basically.
I didn't even need to loop over it. I just printed out text content to the entire list.
Gotcha. So why didn't you share it with the class? Consider it tomorrow. Yeah.
Are those apostrophes or backticks?
Those right there are apostrophes. We're going to be getting to backticks in just a few seconds, actually. So yeah, these are apostrophes. So strings in JavaScript can be marked with either double quotes or single quotes. It really makes no difference. The only difference, truly, is which character you have to escape. So if you wanted to say, "Don't you cuss at me," oh no. We have an apostrophe in there, so it thinks the string ends right there, right? So we need to use a backslash to escape that character. If we're using double quotes, that's not necessary. But then you couldn't say, "Don't you yell cuss at me," without escaping it. Other than that, it makes no difference. I would suggest being consistent and doing whatever it is that other people on your team at your employer do. They probably have a preferred style, just so that everyone's doing it the same way and it's not mixing between the two within the same file. pretty much every team I've ever been on happens to use single quotes for JavaScript, and some style guides prefer that. So I'm going to be using single quotes throughout the class. Not that it matters a whole heck of a lot, but be consistent. So for the sake of getting in the habit of being consistent and getting in the habit of following a style guide, the style guide for the class is single quotes. So use single quotes. Yeah, Jay.
So like in my case, I wanted to have each bar or each added element give it a specific color.
Mm-hmm.
So I was thinking that it would be easier if each element had its own ID or like a way that you could refer back to it specifically.
Okay.
Do that. I mean, maybe not that whole thing, but basically, can you give, when you're doing the inner HTML, can you add
Yeah, you can add attributes. Yeah, totally.
inside the
Yep.
quote?
Yep. Yeah, totally. It's not really necessary just for the sake of targeting them with CSS. We could figure out a way to do that without doing that, but that is a way to do it for sure. Yeah. But if you're using inner HTML, you can put anything that you would put in HTML there, pretty much. Yeah, so single quotes versus double quotes. And I think I pointed out that generally speaking in HTML, attribute values are generally double quoted, but again, it's just a style thing. It doesn't actually make any difference. So I tend to use single quotes in JavaScript and double quotes in HTML, except when I don't. So let's leave that there for just a second. Yes, Ellen?
When you did the homework, you said that we should think in CSS, but like the color change thing. But I was able to do it in JavaScript.
Oh, sure, yeah.
So how would you like take the input from JavaScript and give it to CSS?
I didn't necessarily mean actually put it in a CSS file. Yeah, you can totally use JavaScript to change the CSS, basically. But yeah, via JavaScript. That's kind of what I meant. But we will do it both ways. We may not get to that today, but yeah, you can do the other thing too. You could do what Jay was talking about and give it a class, something like that. So anyway, part 2 of the homework, put it inside a paragraph, and we'll do this a couple different ways here in a minute. Let's just see that worked. Refresh, get my new code. There it is. Now we do see a little padding or margin around it, so I think it worked. If we want to be sure, we could right-click on this and say Inspect. And in our Dev Tools, that opens up the Elements tab, which is right next to Console, with that particular element highlighted. And when we mouse over that, we can see, yes, indeed, that is the paragraph in question. So it is inside a paragraph. We did it. Yay, go us. Notice also, very faintly, there's an $=$ $0. What do you suppose that means? That means, if we want to play around with that paragraph, as long as it's selected in the Elements tab, in the console, we can refer to that element as $0 and play around with it. $0, text content, etc. So if you're trying to figure out, for example, how you get the input out of the form, well, you could find the form in the Elements tab. Now it's $0 and play around with $0. Okay, $0 elements. Yay, that does a thing. By the way, guess what? Now $1 is the paragraph. So the last 4 things that you inspected in the Elements tab are available as $0 through $3. Or is it through $4? Are there 5? Okay. So it gets a little hard to remember what you did like 4 things ago, but that is a really handy way to troubleshoot if something isn't quite what you expect or you want to see what properties an element has. And notice this paragraph was not in the HTML, right? That wasn't in the original HTML. It was added with JavaScript. But it is part of the DOM. So what you see here on the Elements tab is not necessarily the exact HTML you wrote. It's what's in the DOM right now, including stuff that got added later by JavaScript. Cool. So the paragraph's there. Part 2 of the homework done. Super mega bonus credit. Add another input to the form. Display the value of that input alongside the name in the div or the paragraph. Sounds just slightly complicated, so I think I'll put the first 2 parts of the homework in a separate commit. So let's do that. Back in our command line. Guess what? This also makes it easier for your instructors on Friday to go through your GitHub repo and see where you actually did the homework. Put your homework in separate commits. So git add, we know we have to do first. Git commit, need to give it a message. And what we did was update the stats div and update the paragraph inside. Add name to a paragraph in the stats div. Very clear what we did in that commit, how that commit is different than the thing before. Git push will actually sync it with GitHub, and we'll talk more about Git in just a few minutes as soon as we finish the homework. Next, we'll add another input.